My name is Marcos Marrero. I'm from the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. Thank you for all of you who registered to be here, and those who haven't, welcome. So we're going to talk a little bit about food security and sustainability. What we want to have is a lively discussion and an optimistic discussion of what is possible to improve the food security, the food system, and food security in the region. The Pioneer Valley Planning Commission has teamed up with two other planning organizations in Connecticut on a 3-year planning project called the Sustainable Knowledge Corridor. You guys have probably heard about the Knowledge Corridor, referencing to the area all the way from Hartford and New Britain up through the Pioneer Valley. This is a grant from the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Agency, and it's meant to address several livability and sustainability principles. So what the project is intending to do is, in a way, break the silos that that are around sustainability. So it's not just about the environment, and it's not just about what food we eat, but it's also how we live our day-to-day, the transportation, our housing, our economy. So it's a collaboration, as I said, between different planning agencies, the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission on the Massachusetts side, the Capital Region Council of Governments that encompasses everything from the Northern Connecticut down to Hartford, and the Central Connecticut Regional Planning Agency just south of Hartford. And so as planning agencies, naturally, we have several plans already in place, and some plans that we already had planned, such as housing, transportation, land use, environment, right, energy, climate change. So we're not trying to just plan just to plan or replan. We're trying to integrate all of these into one regional execution plan. Something that is not just one document that'll sit on a shelf, but that's a livable document, it's a living document, something that can point to measures that can be implemented and measured over time to measure its success. As part of that emphasis on planning and implementing and measuring, the plan will be complemented by other measures, such as funding for catalytic projects, placemaking in Springfield, for example, improving one of the buildings in the downtown Springfield area, designing transit-oriented development around Holyoke, improving the high-speed rail for the corridor, but also working on capacity building, assisting municipalities with passing some of the regulations that might come out of the plan, connecting some of the nonprofit organizations that might be here in the room, and providing any types of services that the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and our analogous planning agencies can do as well. And as part of that, we don't just want to make a plan from the comforts of our offices, although they are comfy. We want to do this with the people, the stakeholder in mind, right? And we have a very important civic engagement aspect to this plan, and this is why we're here. We want to hear what the stakeholders think is possible and want to happen. So with that, I'm going to leave you with Joseph Kruczynski from UMass. He has been designing our civic engagement tools and our civic engagement effort along with a studio of students, and he will explain what the goals are for our civic engagement.
We are going to, as Marcos mentioned, we're going to keep this as lively as possible after this presentation. So we just want to give you a little bit of context about why we would gather you here to get input on food security and really kind of present it in the bigger picture. So as Marcos mentioned, I'm a professor at UMass in Architecture and Design program, and one of the focuses I have academically and within my research is looking at community engaged architecture and what does it mean to have a community engaged in talking about, reflecting, and providing information about what their built environment might be like. So it's kind of a critical issue that I'm looking at, and together with PVBC on this particular project, that's what we're beginning to do. And the HUD grant is really written in an interesting way because it explicitly says that the outreach efforts of this project need to be aimed at underrepresented communities and communities that don't necessarily participate in the planning process. So So we've had a lot of conversations within our studio and with PVPC about what's the best way to do that. How can we achieve that? And these values have come out of those conversations, and just about being accessible. It's how do we take information that might be very data rich and planner speak, and speak to communities about that information, because we all know that's very important. But how do we make that bridge from a communication point of view? To be inclusive, how truly can we deal with reaching underrepresented communities? How can we deal with the cultural and linguistic social barriers to participation? And then build capacity, that even though we're coming in here, even doing this particular engagement effort today, but when we go into a community and do some work with them, how do we leave that engagement process with some tools for that community to continue to speak and perhaps even advocate on the issues that we're beginning to talk about? So it's not purely a matter of getting the input from the community, but also building capacity for a continued conversation and dialogue about these issues. And as we all know, they're kind of complex. And then be innovative. So how do we do that? How do we do it in different ways? So for instance, one thing in these planning processes, those of you who may be familiar with them, you'd see a flyer that goes up, and the flyer says, we want your input, and please come to this event on November 15th at 6 p.m. at some center. Well, we're not actually doing that in this particular process. What we're doing, sort of what happened here today, this was PV Grows decided to have this event. We recognize that would be a great group of stakeholders to participate with, so we invite ourselves into the process and say, we'd like to talk to you about these issues in this context. Because if I were to call a meeting to try to get all of you at this table, that would be, and if I was successful, I'd be pretty good. I'm not that good. So we want to build on events and networks that are already existing, and then do our engagement work through that method. And that is definitely something that we're doing. So a little bit, the strategies, as I mentioned, we wanted to respond to community-defined needs, work with existing grassroots organizations. So one of the keys of this is working with PV Grows in this particular case. We're working with United Way, Hampshire County, and United Way Pioneer Valley to team up with their partner agencies in a very similar fashion. So we're having a series of conversations with Valley Opportunity Council and the New North End Community Center in Springfield, in Amherst, the Survival Center. So we're having these conversations with community-based organizations and then figuring out ways to engage them in these conversations. And it's a very flexible type of engagement, right? Here it's great, we have 50 people or so here. We may have a group of 10 in some cases, a group of 5. It all matters because we can get the kind of conversation, input, and build capacity of those groups, and that's the goal of the engagement process here. We also are developing a great online engagement. Now, online engagement is fantastic, not necessarily the best for getting to underrepresented communities, but it does provide a good opportunity to be transparent in our process. So on the website, a lot of the activities that we're going to do are going to be the information, and is going to be deposited there. There's also a great online survey tool, and I think everyone who's in attendance today will be getting an email at some point asking you to go on skcmetroquest.com to take this really very interesting survey. It's a little bit more deeper than a SurveyMonkey thing, because you have opportunities to comment, to locate yourself on a map, to really, it's a much more reflective process. So I really encourage everyone to check that out. And we also have our Facebook page that we're just beginning to use. So as Marcos mentioned, we have all these plans, element plans: housing, transportation, land use, environment, food security, green infrastructure, climate action, and workforce development. The question we ask is how to create connections across these areas and how to avoid the silos but have specific conversations. So there may be a lot of you here, this is one of the examples, are interested in food in one way or another. But part of our activity today is to begin to have a cross-sector conversation. How does food, how is it impacted by housing? How is it impacted by transportation? How is it impacted by economic development, which is one of the kind of topic of conversation today with this within this activity. So what we have designed to talk about this project in a public setting is took all those plans and begin to identify them in ways and using words that are evocative and that we can organize things around, but are specific in a way, but are also open. So we have connect, live, prosper, and grow as a way of organizing our work. And connect is primarily transportation issues, but environmental justice and civic engagement plays a role in how we connect as a community. In live, housing is the primary issue, but social equity and healthy communities become a very important part of that as well. In prosper, it's economic development, but that's also education and leadership. And in grow, it's primarily the environment, but it's also renewable energy and food security. So how do all these pieces kind of come together? And we've developed this method so that we can talk about specific issues, but always keep in mind the interconnectivity of them all. If we talk about sustainable communities and how do we develop sustainable communities, that's one of the kind of key aspects. So we've taken it the next step. So that was our first diagram was, okay, this is where all the things can be located. Now how do we make materials, visual materials, verbal materials begin to talk to communities about what this is about? So we've developed this method of talking about we blank sustainably when in each one of these categories, and then developed a series of outcomes in a sense, or things that will are clearly about when we live sustainably. We have fair access to housing that is affordable. We have access to good schools, jobs, and transportation. Our communities are healthy, diverse, and inclusive. And then we have the hook. How do you live sustainably? Because this is the beginning of a process, and we want to be able to kind of get information from people about what sustainability means in their lives. So in each one of the categories, we're looking at this and asking, this kind of question in transportation and how do we connect, how do we prosper, about the economy, about education, about leadership. And the center of gravity that we're going to be working from this afternoon is grow. So how do we steward and protect our natural resources, promote clean, safe, and renewable energy, and support local farms and access to healthy foods. So in each one of these categories, we're going to have conversations that begin to open up into the larger conversation about sustainability in the Valley. And that's one of our goals. Another way that we're developing our engagement materials is also recognizing that the narrative, the story behind each one of those elements, each one of those themes, plays an important role. And we already know that people are living sustainably here, they're connecting sustainably here, they're growing sustainably here, and they're prospering sustainably here. So we are developing a series of video profiles, and I wanted to share one with you right now.
I am Alva Heredia. I'm a single mom, mother of 3. I have 2 boys and a little girl, Alexi, Elias, and Angela Robles. I live in Jackson Street at that project, South Hampshire Heights. Family with Power came, I believe it's 5 years, but it's been 2 years that I've been in Family with Power. It's a small organization with family of low income and people of color. Our goal is to set an example and to be leaders for our community. The farmers market that we did here in Jackson Street, we talked about it because people doesn't feel comfortable going downtown to the market just because it's downtown. Most of them, they don't have transportation. So we decided to do it in the neighborhood. We felt that it was more family, more neighborhood-ish. People feel comfortable because they know who is in front of it and the reason why we did it. Not because of for me or the school, it was more for them. Well, I'm doing it because it's for the future of my kids. A lot of Latinos, and most of the Latino has diabetes. and high blood pressure. So the more they consume more cans and canned food or vegetables or fruit that has too much sodium and trans fat, that it could affect their health. It's more expensive, the fresh fruit, but you get the benefit that you're not gonna get at the supermarket.
So I think that demonstrates one way that we already have these spokespeople in the community that are already doing this work, and that so all of these profiles are going to be with people that are doing work in the four thematic areas: live, grow, connect, and prosper. We've already interviewed a person from Munson who lost their home in the tornado, but now is rebuilding and using green principles for the building. We're talking to someone who actually rides the bus as an everyday activity for their transportation, and with Prosper, we've interviewed a young man who works for Energia in Holyoke, who's doing retrofits and working in the green economy. So we're going to continue to build a library of these kinds of narratives, because I think it's an important way of getting people more engaged and involved by demonstrating what's really already happening, and how can we really build on that, overcome some of the challenges we may have in these contexts, but really kind of build on something that's already, the seed has already been planted in a sense, and we really want to have it flourish. So I'm going to bring it back to Marcos for food security.
So what do we mean when we say food security? And in fact, I have to give a shout out to our advisory committee who have guided us in our work. What we mean by food security is two things. One is reducing hunger in the region, in the valley, making sure that people have access to healthy food. But also, we mean having the capacity for the region to produce the food that it consumes. So this morning I heard from someone at one of my tables that the statistic that it was 10% of the food that we consume in the region is produced locally. You know, it's getting that percentage higher. And there's also a high percentage of people who, you know, can't feed themselves adequately in the region. It's reducing that percentage. And so in terms of the food security plan, what we're trying to do is three things. First, we're going to assess the food system in the region. So we're looking at everything: the production of food, everything from farms to the processing of the food, what happens after it's taken out, it's distributed, it's cut. Acquiring the food either at retail or at either big box stores or retail stores, or people at farmers markets, right? The consumption of food and the factors that affect whether people can will shop for something. In the video, the woman was saying that people had a transportation issue to get to the farmers market, right? We've heard of other cultural issues of what folks can acquire at a farmer's market. It might not be culturally appropriate, so that kind of stuff. And there will be a part of the assessment on the waste side. So we're looking at everything, and we're saying, okay, this is the system as it stands now. This is our assessment. And we're trying to see, well, the system is failing in some senses, right? Because some people are not getting adequate or healthy food. So we want to see how we can make the system better. How can we get people to not be hungry and to eat better, and also to produce more? So we'll offer recommendations either at the local level, state, even federal level. But we also want to see where we can identify gaps and fill those gaps along with stakeholders, nonprofits, municipalities. And then, as referring back to what I said previously with not just planning and doing, but also measuring the progress over time. We want to see whether we're moving the needle on some of these problems. So this is just meant to whet your appetite. These are just some of the things that we know that could be improved, some of the issues regarding food security. Homes have a challenge accessing healthier and lower priced good food. Some urban areas don't have supermarkets, you know, like downtown Springfield. I live in downtown Springfield. I have to leave downtown Springfield to go to a supermarket many times, so West Springfield. The abundance of low quality but very cheap food, convenience stores, fast foods, which just so happens to also be from other areas. Earlier this morning, we were hearing about different entrepreneurs that were identifying barriers, and one of the barriers was just there were good ideas out there, but getting financing for it, right? And then just lack of infrastructure for some other good ideas that might be quasi-public goods, like having a slaughterhouse for many. You like that? Okay. Let's hear cheers for slaughterhouses. You know, of all the stuff that I planned to say today, I didn't think slaughterhouses was going to get the biggest cheer. All right. So that's just meant to illustrate some of the stuff that's out there, but you guys definitely will be able to identify other stuff in our conversation. And so when we talk about the food system assessment, we'll come up with complex maps like these that have different layers. You don't even have to try to understand this, but if you would like to, this is meant to illustrate populations that don't have access to a car living 1 mile from a CSAs. We want to have an assessment where we see, you know, what role does transportation play in the food system, the housing, poverty. You know, we'll be able to see through many different dimensions and identify where the problems lie and where the opportunities lie as well. So what we want to emphasize from here on out is we want to explore what are those opportunities, what are those big ideas that you guys have. We want to dream big. We want to dream through these cross-cutting issues that we've talked about through the economy and the environment, and whether it be poverty or transportation or a well-trained workforce, or whether it be financing or entrepreneurism, right? We want to get from you guys, we want to start a discussion about what stuff is working and how we can make that work even better.
Yeah. So the first issues that we outlined were regulations and how regulations are blocking a lot of local food movements and such. Speak up. And the next thing we talked about was the generational divide between aging farmers and younger farmers, and the need for collaboration of knowledge and resources.
One big thing that we did talk about was, here we are, you know, this group has been formed, the Pioneer Valley Grows, and that this can become a great network for a lot of the goals that we listed out here and a lot of the problem areas that we saw. And there's strength right here in the room with the people that are still here this afternoon, the people who were here this morning, and now there's a listserv that's created so we can all talk amongst ourselves. We talked about some specifics at our table that we see even at the city level, the state level. We talked some about the federal level, you know, regulations and getting food out to people where transportation is an issue. Teaching people how to cook. Somebody mentioned that at our table, that, you know, it's one thing to get the food out to them, but to help them then know what to do with it, you know, if they're not familiar with how to cook, and to get the proper nutrition. Let's see, I'm not sure how to go. We got 7 pages here, so one of the biggies was the regulations that, you know, we are at the mercy of state regulations that get in the way of, you know, growing food and then distributing it. So I know CISA has worked on that some, and that gets into the slaughterhouse issue, where I know there was some effort, a few years ago? We talked a little bit about how different communities have different ethnic populations, and how some of the food, and that someone mentioned that, yes, the farmers are working well with different ethnic populations to, you know, if there's a need, they're answering it with growing certain produce and food products. We talked about the food production facility and how that is one of the things that's working really well here in Franklin County. There's an organization called Earthworks that helps people know how to forage and use food from the forest systems. We talked about teaching children, raising them to know where their food's coming from. Mm-hmm. Yes, we talked about hunting and how that fits in, how that really needs to dovetail more with the agricultural systems, and that there's certainly different opinions about the hunting, but we do have ecosystems that we can take advantage of, not take advantage of, work with. Work with. Yeah, and one thing that we also talked about was, again, where are the folks from CISA? Are you still here? Phil left, okay. We brought up CISA because CISA's been around since what, the late 80s? And in many ways, the CISA brand is strong, but I think it could grow more. And I know people are familiar with the local hero campaign, but we could improve it. We could build on it, and we could talk to the folks within CISA about building more programs from what they've already done within the CISA organization.
I think the last thing I want to bring up is one thing that's working is the Transition Town movement, and how that's working to create more food security in the face of peak oil. We brought up the peaches that came from 9,000 miles away, and yeah, China, and that's an important thing to relocalize, and that's one thing that we've got in the works around here.
So what's working? A lot of discussion about local food and growing food in the community, farm to table, school gardening, community gardens. That was, I think, one of the big positive things that the group talked about. Collaborations between restaurants and food pantries and all sorts of different sources to get local food to people. And then a lot of discussion about how we have obviously a group of passionate people in the community who want to be involved with the local food or food accessibility movement, including higher ed, food policy councils, things like that.
Yeah, so we were talking about how we have this strong, we were talking about how in general there's a very strong culture around valuing local, valuing small, that we've already in the room amongst these organizations done a great job of identifying challenges, and that's one of the assets we have is we've well identified many of the problems to address. And we have the policy councils, which is viewed as a pretty big step forward that will allow us to take a lot of what we've done and go another step politically with change. So those are all great positives to build on.
Okay. Using connections, we talked about other community aspects that maybe weren't represented in the charts that we already saw, including the military and veterans, their sizable military communities that could be also accessing these farm-to-institution movements. Sort of also talk more about increasing those connections between institutions and farmers. Again, political activism and political advocacy came up as part of this. And we also talked about communication, how farms in the region are pretty savvy with communicating with people that they give goods to directly. But then we also talked about the challenges of that when people don't necessarily have internet access. How are we communicating that these community events around food exist to people who don't have the means to access electronic communication? And challenges, obstacles, the capacity of organizations to carry out their goals. We were talking a bit about how some technical schools used to focus a lot more on agriculture. Now the focus has shifted more to high-tech industries and sort of rebuilding that infrastructure to encourage younger people to know where their food comes from. We talked about, yeah, and right, cross-discipline opportunities for development, and sort of how we can work together and through these different community groups and resources, stronger job opportunities, trying to make that a component of developing the food system, and making education a part of that too. So sort of, they're all interconnected in getting more people involved and interested in the process. And then we sort of concluded by talking about the geographic inequities. We have a lot of people here who are enthusiastic about the food system, but there's a large population that either doesn't have the means or the knowledge to really be invested in the movement. And we sort of discussed that in the frame of a rural versus urban divide.
So it was a great conversation. We had a lot of really interesting things that came up. A lot of positives rather than issues, but we did have the major issue of education. I think we can all agree that that's a huge issue. Educating in schools, educating different demographics, different age groups, education throughout our social system, I think we all agreed would definitely benefit this food system or food security issue. Policy was also another thing that obviously can benefit. Trying to make connections was something that we talked a little bit about. Connections through communities, community support, communities supporting one another, people supporting one another through ideas and skill development. We all felt that that could be played up a little bit more. Educating people about the non-monetary costs of buying cheap food was another thing we talked about too. There are lots of health costs associated with purchasing things at a lower cost. You may be saving money, but you're not necessarily saving your health. And another issue was wanting to get people excited about food and food security and buying local food and eating well and feeling better about yourself and supporting your community, which is an easy thing to fix. We did a lot of brainstorming on ways that we could help. Sideways, thank you. Helping education, we talked about that a lot. We brainstormed some ideas for hands-on education and education in classrooms, in elementary schools, physical hands-on education. Ed had brought up a point about education with hatching chicks and just making the connection that this is food and this is where my food comes from. Also, we talked about maybe the reestablishment of home economics in school and teaching people how to process things, how to make things, how to cook, how to use your resources, really. And that also brought up the issue that there are a lot of underused facilities at schools to do lots of these things that no one really takes advantage of anymore. Culturally appropriate food education was another thing that we thought was working well, but could be benefited a little bit. Making sure that different cultures have access to foods that they are comfortable with and foods that they're familiar with. A little bit about culturally appropriate foods in addition to local foods. So a lot of cultures, wouldn't necessarily cook normally with something that we might grow here. So being able to provide something that's both culturally appropriate and local. More democracy was another thing that we talked about, getting everybody involved, hearing everyone's opinion, and that's throughout this entire discussion, something that was very apparent. Another really interesting point that was brought up, I don't think she's here anymore, but she brought up the issue of taking a step back and looking at communities historically. She brought up the town of Orange and how their community was thriving back in the day, and now it's not really, and how do you connect that historical perspective to the modern day economy and assess that and reestablish it and get it rolling again. And we did talk about emphasizing connections. We've talked about a lot of the same things that everyone else has brought up, which is great. I don't really have much more to say. I think we have so many things, it's hard to organize all the thoughts, but.
One thing I didn't hear mentioned was the winter food system around here. So I think most of the things that we were thinking about were actually covered, But so maybe 8 months out of the year, we have a pretty strong local food economy, maybe 7 months. I don't know how many months. And then over the winter, our food economy totally and completely collapses. It's very difficult to get local food around here in the wintertime. I know of only one CSA. Disclaimer, I actually work at it, right, for winter CSA here in Franklin County. And I don't think that's working. I really don't think that's working. I think we have to start demanding local foods in the winter, and then the local CSAs will start producing. Season extension.
On the flip side of the growing part of food cultivation throughout winter is also the fact that we need to be more skilled in extending our season and our ability to access the food that we grow throughout the rest of the year. And there's a whole lot of availability and open space in that area for people to really pick up on cold winter storage, on what grows in the winter, on winter greens, on freezing and blanching and canning and jarring and fermenting. And there are lots of things that you can do to make sure that you can eat the food you grow year round that we ignore a lot of times because it's easier to go to the store and buy a can of soup.
Yeah, and just to bring attention to some of the things she mentioned, there's a whole host of issues that are attached with winter food storage, right? Processing plants, so yeah, cold storage, facilities, right? Education, hoop houses, all these things, all these infrastructures we're going to need going forward to be able to revitalize our winter food system. It wasn't that long ago that 80% of the food that we were consuming was coming from the local area year round. So it's a really, really important issue. I encourage people as winter comes to take a look at their food consumption. I think it's really important.
I really appreciate everyone's collaboration and participation today, and our hope is that these are discussions that build your own capacities to continue to have the conversation, that perhaps at the table something was illuminated or connected for you that you didn't know before you came to the table. So, and if that's the case, I really hope that those conversations can continue, especially within an organization like this. And I do think that PV Grows as a network is an incredibly strong agent in a lot of the goals that we have for this plan. I'm going to have Marcos close, but I just to let everyone know that all our engagement activities ultimately will be documented somehow on the website. So if you want to know what's happening to all this kind of conversations, we'll have summaries of everything that has gone on in here, and all those summaries will go back to the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission to shape the final, in this case, to particularly the food security one. But the objective is that all the planners in all the silos will read this conclusion as well, because hopefully in these conversations we did talk about transportation and housing and how those issues can intersect. So I thank you very much for participating.
I just wanted to thank all of you for being here and participating and giving all your input for the food security plan. So you have an idea of the timeline of the plan. We expect to have something written up in draft form by spring of 2012. So we're taking this feedback, and as Joseph was saying, in other forums, and we're integrating that with the formal assessment that we're doing of data collection so that we can, along with our advisory committees, produce a document that we can show publicly and that we can, again, get more feedback on it. For those of you interested in staying involved, as Joseph was saying, on November 7th, we're going to launch our website, and there will be a lot of information there on how you can get involved and comment and stay in contact with us. SustainableKnowledgeCorridor.org website is redirecting you to a temporary page, so you can get more information on the project there.
So we are, the engagement process as well is the first 2 years of this 3-year project. So one of the things that we're going to do in terms of our engagement is now it's really, the first year is a lot of input and kind of reflection on what the issues are. So hopefully the plan will, even in the draft form, develop some actionable items that we can do. So we're going to do a second round of engagement next year, very, very focused on implementation. So I think that's going to, so And we'll come back to PV Grows next year, and we'll do another round, very, very focused on how do we begin to make the action plan real.
Thank you. Look, just